despite the psychological trap of realizing that if it took 20 minutes to get the slides up, you better use them. But I think I'll spend time on this particular slide here, the title slide, because there's, as you might imagine, a lot packed in just to the title of the book. You might wonder whether I am just being coy with you, not telling you as much about the book as you came to see, because I want to sell you extra copies. But I can tell you that's not the case, because a deal has been struck with the publisher, whereby they will offer the book on a open access basis. So provided you can listen, you can understand what I'm saying now, you will be able to read the book for free. Okay? So I'm not just being coy with you. Let me tell you some of the concerns that led to writing a book on this topic, and then I'll tell you a bit about what's in it, and hopefully in a way which will cause you to want to read the book as professional practitioners within public organizations in Brazil or anywhere. One concern is that professional practitioners, even when they are formally educated, these are professional practitioners within public organizations, even when they're formally educated, as you are here, don't get enough professional knowledge and professional abilities to be a superior professional practitioner. Now, I'm sure that's not true at Abape, but it is true almost anywhere else. And the reason for sort of saying so is I don't think that, by and large, the people who are teaching and developing curriculum have the sort of right theory of their case. I don't think they have the right idea of their discipline, of their area of work, for no fault of their own. Now, lest you think I'm being supremely critical of people in my own field, let me say that I think this is equally true of the field of business management. And I think it's equally true of public policy. Okay? But I don't, I'm not, although I'm interested in those things, I'm a protagonist in the field of public management, so I particularly am concerned with that. And so let me say some of the things that I think would be important for professional practitioners to experience when they are in their education, formal education, which may not actually happen to a sufficient extent. Let me start with, I think I'll start with professional abilities, what I call professional abilities, because this is something presumably we're all working on here, you're all working on here. I use the term here, professional abilities, very advisedly. I don't call them skills. Okay? Obviously, professional practice in public organizations requires skillful performances, at every hour of the day. In that sense, it is as your practice is using skills. But when I think the idea of using skills is mainly key to the idea of manipulating things methodically to produce a very specific result, okay, that can be planned in advance. My analogy for this, I don't know if you have IKEA here in Brazil, but if you ever have gotten a flat pack from IKEA that is supposed to become a bookshelf, you know that you have to skillfully put it all together. To me, that's skills. If you're engaged in planning in a public organization, or management control, or performing many of the technical tasks that perform the fundamental functions in government, most of what you are doing, particularly as a managerial practitioner, is not like assembling an IKEA bookshelf. Okay? All of the work is interactive. You can do it methodically. You can have an intent in mind, But it's not like assembling an IKEA bookshelf. So what are these things? Well, at some level, you could call them very sort of mundane things, like writing a memo, preparing for a meeting, going to a meeting, making a talk to other people, going by your boss's office spontaneously, probably not so spontaneously, and raising an issue and making a suggestion. These mundane aspects of management and of professional practice. Well, I think that you can say that, well, that's just common sense, but actually people could have that common sense developed by careful education and training. And so one of the parts of this project is to say, all right, for a professional practitioner to have great competence, what are the professional abilities that they need to develop and have strong and utilize in conjunction with other things like professional knowledge of those organizations and the specific functions they do. So I'd like to offer you a list of these things, and you can maybe compare this list to how you're being trained here. And the list comes from actually my time in Brasilia, because I've been working with ENAPE, the Escola Nacional de Administração Pública, for 3 years. And at one point, one of the general coordinators looked at me very seriously and said, what are the competences people need to be innovative in government? Okay. And I gave an answer just off the cuff, and it's still in the book, so it must have been okay. And there are 4 things. Can you think of 4 things, 4 professional abilities that are not specific to public management, but absolutely essential to being competent at tackling, it's an Americanism, tackling challenges in public organizations, especially to do with their management. Okay? That's what my subject matter is, tackling challenges in public organizations, especially those that relate to management. I didn't say doing public management because that means nothing to anybody. Engaging in professional practice within public organizations, especially, not exclusively, concerned with management is my subject. Okay? If you're going to tackle them, then you have to do that in a competent way. Basic idea is you need to combine knowledge with professional abilities. So if you buy that argument up to this point, the question that begs is, what are these professional abilities? I'll get to the professional knowledge in a minute. So everybody can have their own list of professional abilities. I have a criterion for professional abilities, and that is there has to be a theory about it. Somebody has to have worked out a theory of that kind of ability, because professional abilities can only be seen when you do it. Professional abilities can only be improved if and when you reflect back on what happened, okay, and ask the question whether what happened is good enough, and if it were done better, would you get a different result? In order to have that conversation with yourself or with an instructor, there has to be an idea of what that professional ability is for, what it's supposed to consist in, and how it's supposed to work. So I need some kind of theory in order to do that. So my list corresponds, so there's a theory behind everything on my list. Number 1, sense making sense of a situation. You can't really do anything that fits or responds thoughtfully to the situation if you haven't made astute observations about what is going on now, what the state of affairs is, perhaps even about how we came to be this way. Also, it's very hard to move forward toward tackling a challenge if you don't have some orientation to what would be better than the situation you encounter, what direction is up. So even sense-making does require the formation of some idea of intent relative to where you are today. So I think making sense of situations within public organizations is itself an important professional ability. There are theories about how you could do that poorly. There are theories about how to get confused. There are theories about how to avoid realities. We need to be aware of those so that we can somehow neutralize those built-in tendencies to size things up inappropriately or incorrectly. So that's one. Another relates to the idea that management or professional practice within public organizations, especially to do with management, just don't want to say public management, obviously, involve decision making. In fact, in many traditions, in fact, all of the major traditions of thinking about management, management is almost defined as effectuating the intent of organizations or enterprises by making decisions. That sounds so obvious that it's almost not worth noting, but that leaves out a lot of things, and I'll come to that. But insofar as that's a sound argument about the nature of management, raises a question about what are the professional abilities that need to be brought to bear to make decisions competently. And a general answer for that is that you need to be good at deliberation. And that requires being good at judgment. This is an old idea, been around for centuries, been formalized in theories of good decision-making, good moral decision-making, particularly in the High Middle Ages by the Jesuits, who developed the moral theory and moral practice of casuistry. Talked about this once before. And the idea there is that making that when you're deliberating between different courses of action, okay? Not deliberating about, building this or building that, okay, and how that might be done, but deliberating between courses of action, some of which would be more morally justifiable than others, some might be more practically justifiable than others, but in all cases, you're handed alternatives essentially from which you need to choose. And the task is to come up to choose the best option. The best option that, in particular, that could be presented and rationalized to the members of your community, your peers, whether they're in the same religious community or the same social strata. And so here we have a picture of, and it's hard to do because the principles that you could follow are too gross, too universal, not sharp enough to tell you what actually to do in circumstances, taking into account the actual realities that you face. So you'll inevitably find yourself with dilemmas, okay? Because the principles are going to point you in contradictory directions, and that's when you need to use judgment and weigh things and come up with an answer. And when you and it's very hard to describe the process of deliberation, because you can't keep track of our thinking. So what gets explicit is what happens downstream when you've made your decision and you're explaining it to somebody else, so that they would agree that or at least not disagree with your answer of what is the best option to do in these circumstances. And so that back-end process of rationalizing judgment can be theorized in terms of argumentation. That's the second one. Argumentation is providing a rational account for the choice of an option of what to do. Okay? And it takes a familiar form. Okay, so the purpose of it's for getting people who have claims on you not to disagree, perhaps even to endorse, but at least not to disagree with your decision about what is the best option to take, what is the best course of action to take. And then what does it consist in? It consists in, well, a speech or a written text, and it has a recognizable form. It has identifying the topic at hand, it identifies the issues, it defines the claims about the issues, what you should do, gives reasons for your choice of what to do, considers counter-arguments, rebuts the counter-arguments, draws the conclusion. Okay? And this is something that can be taught. I find in my teaching that my students, except from very specific small corners of the globe, don't know how to do that. They can't recognize that thing. They can't recognize what argumentation is. As a consequence, it is very hard to teach them how to argue, because it's very hard to critique what they write in a memo, or what they say in class, or what they write in an essay, because there's no shared basis to communicate what is adequate or inadequate about their rational argumentation. I think that's also true in many workplaces. You probably have people who work for you, who you ask questions of, and you don't get a straight answer with reasons behind it. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to point them somewhere to a standard for how it is you would formulate and present a rational argument about what choices you would make when you are trying to establish the best option in a complex circumstance. But this can be taught because it's been taught since the High Middle Ages. It just sort of abandoned, Western culture abandoned it for 600 years, but it's come back. All right, I'm down to two. A couple are missing. I'm going to skip to, I'm going to do one before the one that I think is the most important. Okay? The next one I think is important because you could provide people with a rational argument, very well-structured rational argument, and you might leave them cold, which is an expression in English, meaning they're not moved by what you have to say. They may not disagree with you. The argument may be completely sound. They have nothing to, they think you've addressed their concerns through your rebuttals, but they don't care, so to speak. They're not moved to think differently. They're not moved to act differently. And so we need ideas which suggest how you might go about moving people to different beliefs and moving people to a sense of different realities according to which they might behave differently. And there are theories about how to do that. And these are relevant to professional practice. The theorist that I look to for insight into these issues is someone called Irving Goffman, G-O-F-F-M-A-N, G-O-F-F-M-A-N. If you're on the net, go look in Google Scholar for Irving Goffman, and in particular his book, Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And if your Google is like my Google search engine, you'll find 57,000 sites. It's been out there, that's partly due to longevity. It was published in 1959. It's just slightly younger than me. A bit more younger than you. And more immensely influential. And in the book, Goffman says, Shakespeare once wrote, the world is but a stage, and we are but its players. And that's completely false. It's just not true. Much more to social reality than that. But saying why that's not true is really hard, to be really specific. Okay. And he develops a whole theory of how it is that social impressions, anyway, of social reality become formed, and how they take hold to such an extent that people think it is natural. People think it couldn't be any other way. So there are ways in his theory, which gives you avenues of thought to construct the way you're going to present yourself in a situation, the way you're going to present your relationships with other people, called team members in the situation, to project your sense of the social order or the social networks, as I just did with my friend. You can project ideas. You can have ideas about how to project ideas so that they become part of the reality that people live within. And if you ever go to a meeting or you knock on your boss's office, you are engaging in this kind of dramatic performance, whether you intend to or not. And since you're doing that, you might as well know a few theories about dramatic performances, because it will help. And the last of these four, last four professional abilities, begins with a D, and it's one that isn't typically discussed in public administration and in management. That means it's not never discussed, it's just not typically discussed, and it is designing. Now, designing, well, it's a term that's been around a long time. It's something that engineers in particular have strong ideas about. I think many engineers think that when they are spend their effort with the purpose of creating a novel system or a novel product for commercial or other purposes, that they are engaged in designing. Architects, when they're formulating a plan for a new building, think of themselves as designing. People who are creating new software within an enterprise think of themselves at some point as designing a new system, so on and so forth. So it's not like we're not aware of designing, and there are actually theories of designing which are rather interesting, and I would argue that these theories are relevant to professional practice for public organizations and especially the management of them. Okay? And we ought to bring that into the center of our understanding, not to exclude other things, but in the center of our understanding of professional practice and the abilities to do it. Now, where does this thing fit in? I think it fits in particular as a contrast to argumentation and decision-making. Argumentation and decision-making is anchored in the idea that if you've been handed alternatives, you will have a methodical and thoughtful way, mindful way to get an answer as to what is the best option. Design is about creating the alternatives in the first place. That's pretty important. And that doesn't, and there are arguments that people who have responsibility in enterprises ought to use that responsibility, have to use their offices to foster conditions that will lead to the development of representations of possible systems or plans or ideas for incorporation into the organization or enterprise. That if you're going to get a novel thing that might work to help effectuate the intent of the organization or the enterprise, it will result from a process involving quite a lot of people, with each of whom brings to the party or the table different bodies of knowledge, different background experiences, all of which is necessary to be factored in to the process of creating a representation of something that might work to further the effectuation of intent in the organization. A lot of abstractions, but this idea of design is not often taught. First of all, the professional ability of designing is not often taught in management or public administration. Yes, in management classes now you'll have something about how to design a piece of software in some design class. You might have you might learn something about design thinking in a marketing class to create a new product. So I'm not trying to be extreme in my views, but I don't think it is typical, and I don't think this aspect of management is kind of part of the conceptual core of professional practice in management, in either the private sector or the public sector. And I think that is unfortunate, because I think it is very hard to tackle the problems, the challenges in public organizations, especially their management problems and challenges, if the practitioners are not capable of designing things that would work to perform the functions that effectuate the intent of the organization. And so you might be your professional practice might help you make decisions, make choices, but it's not good enough. making decisions on the basis where you choose between not so good alternatives, not so well formulated alternatives, is a kind of a fool's errand. And it's not what you want to be doing. So I think we need to rebalance, if you wish, our picture of the capabilities, of the professional abilities of such managers. And the only way to do that is to give people tasks and to give them feedback on what they've done that reflects these theories. And for the feedback to make sense to the people, you have to talk them something about the theories, otherwise you're just using words that you know and they don't. That actually does involve sometimes stepping back and providing bits of education that you might hope people had gotten at an earlier stage in their career. But if that's not true, you have to fill in the missing bits. That's sometimes particularly hard to do in an international environment, so to speak, where you have students from all countries, as we do in London School of Economics. Less of a problem for you, but if you're handicapped by the fact that everybody comes from a different country and 15% of your students are Chinese and so on and so forth, there are ways around, they haven't exactly all been educated in rational argumentation. You have to fill in the blanks. Okay, so my picture, so stepping back, what am I trying to say? Public management is a form of professional practice, and there are other forms. It's distinct, just insofar as the professional practice is concerned with public organizations. Public organizations are not empirical things in this theory. They are purposeful things. They have a purpose. The purpose is to, now I have to use, if I'm going to talk universally, I need to use a piece of theory, because you can't talk universally without a piece of theory. A piece of theory is creating public value. It's a term that you probably may have come across. What is its role in this kind of theorizing? It plays the role of the universal intent of a public organization. You might ask them, what is a public organization? Public organization is not just the structure, it's not just the people, it's also let's say the programs, so the very functionality of the organization. The business, if we were talking about it in private sector terms, the program of the organization. And it also is a movement through time of that same organization in every facet of it. Okay? So that's a background picture of what I'm talking about when I talk about a public organization. It's an enterprise, a form of enterprise which has as its intent creating public value. Now when you start practicing, you have to interpret these things concretely for your case and make an argument about it. So the theory just gives you a point of departure for developing arguments and designs for your particular case at a particular time. That's a very limited role for theory. It doesn't tell you what's the right answer and the wrong answer. It doesn't give you a method. It just gives you a starting point in reasoning about for professional practice. Right. I'm going to say just a few things about professional knowledge. Because before I said, look, to be competent, you need both the skill, sorry, I made my own mistake, the professional ability, and some professional knowledge. You need them both. Now, the idea that you need professional knowledge to tackle problems or challenges of public organizations is not universally espoused, not universally emphasized, believe it or not. Okay? It was mentioned that I taught at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. At that institution, public management was shaped by bringing into the discussion of public management many ideas about business leadership, business management, from specifically the ideas that came all the way from across the river in Boston from the Harvard Business School. And the Harvard Business School emphasized having general ideas about businesses and organizations and corporations, emphasized a lot about professional abilities, particularly sense-making, argumentation, and dramatization, although they didn't formalize it. Okay. But they didn't say much about professional knowledge. There's a whole other tradition in management, much more younger, that said if you want to have effectuate the intent of public organizations, develop knowledge on the basis of scientific theory, develop, particularly about performing one or another function in an organization like finance, operations, or marketing. Put all of these theoretical ideas on a sound theoretical and scientific foundation, then teach the students how to skillfully apply the theory to make a decision on the basis of the theory. This was imitating modern medicine quite specifically. And there, 90% of the emphasis was on knowing stuff, because if you had a scientific or theoretical understanding of how to do finance, you could derive the answer to the decision question. Different tradition. These are rival traditions in management. So in that tradition, the modern medical school tradition, what got the headlines was the knowledge. In the Harvard tradition, what got headlines was the abilities. Okay. Something seems unbalanced there, right? Wouldn't it be good to give equal emphasis to the abilities and to the knowledge? If you're going to go down that path, you might as well say we're kind of taking the Harvard approach and making it a little bit better, rather than taking the modern medical school approach and making it a little softer. So I'm taking the Harvard approach and making it a little bit better by pulling in these ideas about design, in particular, which, as you will know, comes from Herbert Simon and his ideas about professional practice and professional discipline, best expressed in the Sciences of the Artificial, chapters 1 and 5. Now, what is professional knowledge for? It is not for telling you how to get the right answer. It is to give you insight for tackling the challenges of public organizations and especially their management. Insight that will help you as you go through the process of tackling these challenges. Process that will, in concept, result in something like a solution, something in the form of something that could work, whether it's a plan or a system or an idea or an organizational arrangement. It doesn't tell you what to do. It helps channel your thinking and channel the thinking of others as you respond to the totality of information and the totality of concerns that you possess at the point where you're trying to tackle the problem. This is the idea of designing. In designing, right, you're tackling a problem. You're trying to effectuate intent. Sorry, you're tackling a challenge. You're trying to effectuate intent, bearing in mind that you might be handicapped in reaching it for any number of reasons given your actual circumstances, and you need to find ways to neutralize or overcome those handicaps through the very composition of the plan or the system or the idea that you're trying to create. And there's no right answers, okay, but there are millions of ways to go wrong. And there's many ways to waste your time, and time matters, okay, in these kinds of practices. And so some knowledge will help you as channel your thinking and interactions with others as you formulate systems, representations of systems, representations of plans, representations of ideas that can be used within the enterprise to effectuate its intent. So now, if you're willing to go that distance and think of the professional knowledge as being used in a process that has many of the characteristics of designing, as distinct from only the characteristics of decision making, or only the characteristics of finding the right answer through derivation, then you're going to want to look closely at what that knowledge is and how it could be helpful, professional knowledge. I'd suggest there are two forms of professional knowledge that you might want to be conscious of. And just stepping back, if you have this view of the field, which is field as a professional discipline, a design-oriented professional discipline, that has implications for how you would teach, and it would have implications for how you would learn and how you would develop yourselves through the course of your career. So, two forms of, I'm just going to be briefer and more accelerated here, two forms of professional knowledge. And the precedent for answering the question, what are the forms of professional knowledge that I'm drawing on, is the professional field of architecture. Okay, anybody know any architects? No? You know some architects? Okay. Architects say, at a minimum, when you're sort of formulating a plan for a building, okay, you need to consider lineage and precedent. Lineage is a kind of theorization of different patterns that buildings could take, and these patterns arise in history, okay? And you can kind of recognize their shift over time in the same culture, and you can look at differences across cultures. But it's kind of a theorized view of what it would be to be a good building, a bit of a theorized view of how, as an architect, you could move toward the formulation of a representation of the building. Let's call that theory for the moment. Everybody loves theory. But you can see it's a theory of how to get something in the world that effectuates somebody's intent. It's not a theory of gravity or a theory of the universe. The term I use for those kinds of theories are purposive theories. They're theories that you use to clarify and pursue purposes, as opposed to theories of what the universe is made of and how it behaves. And there's a lot of purposive theories in men, right? In fact, most of the theories that we have are of that character. They don't tell you what is true about the universe. They don't tell you exactly what to do, but they are helpful to you if you understand them as you proceed with others toward tackling a challenge that you face. We don't have a good word for this kind of theorizing, I think. So we have to, right? Immanuel Kant had not a bad term for this kind of theorizing, but we usually don't talk about Immanuel Kant in management, right? He called it functional teleological theorizing. Okay? And imagine trying to sell that. You can just see it on the front of a management book at the airport. Functional teleological, what you can learn about management from Immanuel Kant, the words. Functional teleological argument. I come up with another name for it. It's called mechanism intent thinking, because I don't want to use functional teleological argument. It's too philosophical. Design thinking has already been branded by other people. Engineering thinking sounds like it's you're going to be a technocrat and you can only think technologically about solving problems in enterprises. So all of the other terms have baggage. Okay? So I'm creating something that, at least for now, won't have baggage. Maybe in 18 months it will get its own baggage. So, for purposive thinking is part of professional knowledge. And so you might as well learn how to do that. The problem in our field is our purposive theorizing is a mess. Okay? Anytime you read a work, it feels like a completely different work than the next one. It's exhausting to read the literature in our field because everyone is a universe in and of itself. They have to rewrite all of the theoretical contributions to our field so that they fit some kind of pattern. Otherwise, it's useless when it comes to the point of trying to solve problems, because it would take forever to figure out how one argument relates to the next. Okay, and if you can't put, and since no single argument is going to give you a body of knowledge, you need to have multiple arguments. Yeah, and they need to be similar enough that you can compare them, find the strengths and weaknesses, and synthesize. That requires rewriting them. Thaisa, you remember how horrible this was? See, before I had this idea, I made you rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, and I didn't know what I was asking you to do. And guess what? You had the same problem. This is now sorted. So you need to rewrite all the theories, asking, because they're actually addressing three questions, or whatever they're talking about. One, and let's say it's strategic planning to keep a case in mind. Yeah? What is it for? Remember, these things are not objects, right? Are not naturally occurring objects. Okay? I mean, if you look at me and you ask the question, what is it for? It's not for anything. It just came, right? If you ask about this, you know, you can say, there is a what is it for, right? You can answer that question. So that's one question, what is it for? Right? Second question is, what does it consist in? Some plastic, a round shape, at least people look at it that way. It has a certain cone kind of shape overall. Somehow it has these little ridges for reeds to hold on, maybe to hold on to it or something. Anyway, it consists in a number of things. And then the last question is, how does it actually work? What causal processes are kind of activated by the organization of the material, okay? Such that the outcome of its use is something you care about, hopefully positively. 3 questions, and you can ask, whenever you look at a piece of writing about management or your field, reinterpret along the following lines. What are they saying the thing they're talking about is for? What are they saying it's made out of? Okay, what are the activities, for example, that are supposed to take place in this system or activity or value chain element or whatever? In talking about what does it consist in, it's always hard to draw boundaries between what's inside and what's outside. If in doubt, take the stuff that's outside and say it's still part of the thing. Context is actually often part of what it consists in. And then the hardest question is, how does it work? Because you have to explain the outcomes, the pattern of outcomes in these activities, and then ask what causes these outcomes, and finally ask, why do we care about these outcomes in terms of the intent of the system? Those are really good questions to ask with theory. So and if you rewrite everything you read in those terms, you can actually see a pattern. In my book, I try to do this by rewriting 9 items that I think are relevant to public management theorizing, purpose of theorizing, not scientific theorizing. I think I can finally go to a chart for this purpose. In chapter 4, I take you on a tour of the public management gallery. How many of you have actually been to the public management gallery?
Never.
There's a reason.
Sorry.
It doesn't exist.
Okay.
It only exists in chapter 4. But it has a precedent. The precedent is the Bauhaus archives in Berlin. Bauhaus was an important movement in the creation of the very idea of design and designing. Weimar Germany between the wars. Many very famous artists, architects, and other designers were part of it. Walter Gropius, Paul Klee, Johannes Itten, Ludwig van der Mies, all were part of it at one point or another, big names. And if you go there, the thing you would want to do is pick up the audio guide and walk through. It's a very simple museum. There's just like about 8 or 9 displays. Each display is about one of these people, their role in the movement, the Bauhaus movement and school, and their philosophy of teaching and their philosophy of practice, all in about 6 or 7 minutes. So, in the public management gallery, I do that. I basically give you the audio tour. So for every one of the works, I have about 1,500 words, and they're all, and in each case, the text is answering the question for what they're talking about. What is it for? What does it consist in, and how is it supposed to work? On the upper floor, it's a 3-floor structure, as you can see, and the upper floor is about theories of public management. And the displays there are about Mark Moore's book, Creating Public Value, Strategic Management and Government. It came out in English in 1995 and in Portuguese in 1999, I believe. And I go through that routine. And then I turn to the work that drove Thaisa crazy, John Bryson's strategic planning in public and nonprofit organizations. It's also about public organizations. Somehow, it's very different experience reading that than reading Mark Moore. although you wouldn't say they disagree on anything. Yet, it's a completely different book. Drives you crazy. So, but if you do what I do, which is say, what do they say it's for, what is it consistent, and how does it work, you actually can put these texts side by side and have a feeling for something like coherent discussion of purposive theorizing in public organization. And you go down one level, and you come across some discussion of what I call design projects. This is a theoretical idea of how innovation happens in organizations. It is not in the Harvard tradition. It comes right out of Herbert Simon's work on science is the artificial. It is not in the modern medical school tradition. They don't do design projects. And there are three discussions there of Simon's very book, Science is the Artificial, in particular chapter 5. There's a further discussion of a nice book that picks up these themes and brings it firmly into the study of organizations and management by Van Aken and Behrens, called Problem Solving in Organizations. And then there's a book called Preparing for the Future, Strategic Planning in the U.S. Air Force that Armando mentioned earlier on, which looks at design projects from the perspective of people at the top of the organization trying to lead, and in particular influence the course of planning, but not make the plans their own for the sake of influence and longevity in the plans themselves. And then you go down to the bottom floor and you pick up where I started, and theories of the professional abilities that professional practitioners and public organizations need to cultivate and use as part of tackling the challenges in public organizations, and especially their management. And so I have look at works that look at theorized sense making, designing, argumentation, and dramatization. So this is not the sum total of professional knowledge about public management, but provides a kind of good starting point, I think, particularly because it covers three different, I won't call them levels, but layers of discussion within purposive theories of organizations, public organizations as such, design projects through which novel systems, plans, and ideas are generated, and finally a lower level, which is what professional practitioners kind of are engaging in experientially, minute by minute, day by day, week by week, month by month. It seems to me that building on this structure would be a good idea, and if we did so, we might have, at least as purposive theorizing goes, a coherent body of professional knowledge for use in tackling challenges in public organizations. The other bit is from architecture, precedent. Okay, this is the lineage stuff. This is the analogy to lineage in architecture. The analogy to precedent from architecture I call precedent. In specific, not architectural precedent, but design precedent, because the literature on design has given me that word. That requires looking at experience, looking at it not to tell a story, looking at it not to just give a report, but looking at it to so that you can rediscover the design that is inside of it. You read about reverse engineering, you just go to Wikipedia, not WikiLeaks, but Wikipedia, you look for reverse engineering, and you scroll down a little bit, you'll find some beautiful terms about it. It says the first thing you need to do is decide what is the subject system, and that's something that is distinguishable from its environment or setting, and then ask the questions, what is it for, what is it consist in, and how does it work? Okay? And when you answer the last question in particular, you're rediscovering the design in it by an outsider looking in, and perhaps understanding the design as well as the designer understood it, him or herself, at the time that it was being designed, but never written down. We need to do case studies with this idea in mind. We should do case studies so that it results in insight about how the subject system, it might be a planning process, it might be a way of bringing about change, it might be a budgeting system, it may be any number of things. We might want to ask questions about what is it for, what is it consist in, and how does it work. If you follow that line, then I think you produce insight into how things could work, not to copy them, but to use as insights to tackle your problem. Just like architects use precedent along with and in combination with lineage or theory to give them sufficient guidance to channel their thinking so that they have a hope of coming up with some system, plan, or idea whose use in the organization would clarify and effectuate its intent. A lot of thinking, but that's the basic thing. And so we should be teaching people how to evaluate experience and study experience in these terms. My own work along those lines has been going on for a while. The first time I really set my mind to doing what I now call a design-focused case study, which is trying to understand the subject system and what it was for and what it was made out of and how it worked, was Brazil in Action. And we struggled with that study because we didn't really know what we were trying to do. We didn't know how it fit into an idea of research and a discipline. So in retrospect, we could have done that. Right, so I think I've told you, I could fill in a lot of background and say a lot of other things, but hopefully you've now gotten a picture of the whole here. I'll go back now to the title slide. Public management. Nobody loves public management. Nobody knows what it is. Okay? So we have to work on that ourselves. What is public management? Bad question. What's it for? It's helping professional practitioners tackle the challenges in public organizations, especially those that have something to do with management. Okay? That's what it's for. Okay? What does it consist in? A couple of enterprises. One is a teaching and learning enterprise that you're part of. Another is a discipline development enterprise that I'm trying to do in my book. Okay? The teaching and learning enterprise has three functions. You have respiration and circulation and some other function. The teaching and learning enterprise has strengthening practitioner competence, acquiring professional knowledge, strengthening or improving professional abilities. Those are the functions, interdependent, connected, interlocking functions of the teaching and learning enterprise. So as an implication for instructors designing courses, anything you do should be a feature that helps perform one or more of those functions. Strengthening professional competence, acquiring professional knowledge, and improving professional abilities. And if you were to know that that's the structure of that's the sort of functional design of the course, you would probably know how better to study. And your effort to study would be more aligned with your own intent, which is to become a superior professional practitioner. There's a lot of work to be done to migrate the professional discipline of public management from where it is to a state as I envision it or describe it in my representation. That's a long journey. Hopefully you'll come along with us and get the benefits from it both today and in the future. So thank you for your attention.
Questions?